All right, this is my final opportunity now to infect you with a spirit that will really make you dangerous in the religious scene. And I take up the area of the ethical spirit of Jesus. And we see here the great clash between the religious cult and his spirit. We'll see a great difference between the way the cult defined right and wrong and the way Jesus looked at right and wrong. As always, where you have a religious cult, sin has to be defined legally. You know, even membership is a legal thing in the cult. And right and wrong has to be written down and defined legally, and sin is law-based. The attitude, the concept of sin is law-based. A law-based concept of sin. On the other hand, Jesus' concept was not based on the law, the written code, but his whole approach to the question of right and wrong was people-centered and people-orientated. You see this illustrated, of course, in the account in the Gospels of Jesus healing the man with the withered arm. Here were the good guardians of the cult, with their Torah, waiting for Jesus to break the norm, to break the rules, because it was the Sabbath day. And here Mark makes a surprising statement. Jesus looks upon them with anger. He saw the hypocrisy of it. Why? They didn't care one whit about that poor man. Their concern was not for people. Their concern was to maintain the rule of the cult. Because always where you have a religious cult, the supreme sin is to break the cultic taboo, whatever it happens to be. And they were waiting for Jesus to break the rule, and he certainly did. But he said, "You hypocrites." He was angry because their insensitivity and their lack of compassion for people. He said, "You hypocrites. You yourself break the Sabbath in order that you circumcise a man on the 8th day. In other words, you will even be willing to cut off a little bit of skin. You'll break the Sabbath to do that. And here you call me into question because I give a man wholeness and restore his arm." What happens in the cult is that ethics becomes terribly distorted. It sends people on a flea hunt, looking for specks of sawdust when they can't see the great redwood log. That's how distorted Jesus says your whole concept of right and wrong. The speck of sawdust becomes bigger to you, more important than a whole redwood log. And what happens is that sin becomes trivialized. Oh yes, there's lots of talk in every religious cult. The favourite thing to preach about often is sin. Lots of talk about sin. Witch hunting against sin. Sin, sin, sin. Such talk against sin. But all it really does is trivialize it. Because everything becomes totally distorted. The big sin, of course, is whatever breaks the cultic taboo. I suppose the Jews could get some justification from stories in the Old Testament on that type of thing. Here is Samson in the Old Testament is surprisingly frank. Bit different from some of our Western culture. But it tells us about Samson. It says he sleeps with a harlot all night and he does other things that are quite scandalous. Doesn't seem to affect him. Goes out in the morning, gets up the big gates, throws them away as if they're nothing. And then someone cuts the hair of his chinny chin, and he's had it. In contrast, the amazing thing is that Jesus rarely uses the word sin. That's the surprising thing as you really read the gospel. He often avoids religious jargon. And certainly doesn't have any theories of sin. He doesn't tell whether he supports the Traducian theory. I'm referring to a bit of church history here. It's not the Traducian theory of sin, how it originates, nor the creationist theory, nor the federal or the governmental theory of sin, or the imputation of Adam's transgression and how it works, either federally or governmentally. Do you know the difference? Well, you ought to. He has none of that. And of course they wanted to know in his day theories of sin. They meet a blind man. Now, they said, how's the theology of sin work with this blind man? Did he sin or did his father sin? You know, they wanted to know all the theories of sin. Jesus wipes it all aside. And the surprising thing is, to expose evil, he tells stories in which he turns the whole world upside down. Now, I want you to get the central thrust in all the stories of Jesus. What's he getting at? He tells the story of two debtors. And of course this he does to expose how they can't see where real evil is. They were chasing the specks of sawdust, you see. They were straining at the net. They were waiting for people to break the cultic taboo. They couldn't see the log. No, he said there were these two debtors. Now the first one, he owed his boss millions of dollars. That's what it really means in the setting. He was millions of dollars in the red. He had stomach ulcers, worrying about it. He was taking sleeping pills. The boss heard about it. He says, listen, Jack, forget about it. I can cover that. I've got resources to meet that. Just forget about it. Let's go on. Our friendship means more than that debt. Come on now. Forget it. Throw your sleeping pills away. You're free. Why, Jack ought to have gone out so free. He ought to have had springs in his legs. And when he meets Bill, who owes him a few dollars, he ought to have been, forget about it, Bill. Instead of giving me those just miserable $10, here's 10 more. On his way he goes. No. Someone owes him just an insignificant thing. And you know what he did? No spirit of forgiveness. Now Jesus says, that's what you Jews are like. It's this spirit of alienation, this attitude to others, the spirit with which you relate to others. That's the big thing that makes you so unlike your Father in heaven and keeps you alienated from God. And then there's the Pharisee and the tax collector story. The Pharisee, no doubt about him, he is a good fellow. He does everything that the law says he ought to do. And he even has enough humility to thank God that he's not like the tax collector. Now Jesus says, this false security of the good Pharisee and his attitude to others who are not within the cult, it's more of an offense to God. It's more a distortion of what man is meant to be. It separates, it alienates you from God more than the scandalous behaviour of the tax collector. It is far, far worse. In the story of the elder brother. The elder brother, who always does what's right, he's in a worse position. It's harder to reconcile him to the Father than the boy who lives with harlots and eats with pigs. And I could go on with all the stories of Jesus. What he is showing is the attitude to others The thing that alienates you from sympathy, from compassion, from solidarity, the thing that alienates you from your brother, from your neighbour, that's the thing that alienates you from God. That's the big log that you're not seeing in your preoccupation with your rule book religion. You see the thrust of a people-centered ethic? But what is the essence of this spirit of alienation, which he says is the great evil? It's embodied in the cult. Because the religious cult is simply the expression, the corporate expression, the institutionalization, the legitimatization of that spirit. So the spirit of the cult, so far as being a bulwark and a defense against evil, a protection against sin, the spirit of the cult itself is the expression par excellence of the thing that separates man from God. You see the point? What an exposure. What a threat to the cult at its very heart. Of course, that challenge of Jesus is just as applicable to the Christian cult, with our biblicism, with our institutionalization of the Christian religion. Wherever you have an institutionalization, all institutionalism is based upon the genius of law and constitution and a code of conduct. And whatever the religious situation is, where people live in the religious cult, the supreme sin always is that which breaks the special thing of the cult. Look, if I said, I'm going to begin a new Christian thing, Jesus said, if your eye offends you, cut it out. Okay? Pluck it out. Now we have to do something drastic to prevent our eyes seeing things that we ought not see. So what we need is a special form of dark glasses that will prevent you to see anything evil. Right? So we have, this proves that we are better than anyone else, of course. We are the elite people. We all wear, as the sign that we are the true people of God. Of course, this is ridiculous, of course, but I'm using an illustration. We all wear a certain type of dark glasses that distinguishes us from everybody else. Those within, those without, the sinners from the non-sinners. Here we are the special people. We wear the dark glasses so that we don't offend. Now, naturally, in that sort of situation, what would be the sin par excellence in that group? Forget about being unkind, uncompassionate. You could be as judgmental as you like. In fact, you go around judging everybody that doesn't wear your dark glasses. The sin par excellence is not to wear dark glasses. You see, that always happens. In a religious cult, the supreme sin is to break the taboo, and how it becomes magnified. There was a Jewish rabbi and a Roman Catholic priest who became close friends, even first-name basis, Benjamin and Patrick. And when they got chummy, the rabbi and the priest, one day Patrick said to the rabbi Benjamin, "Now, Benjamin, I'd like you to ask you something. Be honest. Confess up now. Have you ever tasted how delicious ham is?" And the rabbi said, "Yep, I'll be honest." He said, "I've eaten ham." "Now," said Benjamin, here was Benjamin's chance. He said to the Catholic priest, "You've guessed it." He said, "I want to know something. You be honest with me now. Come on," he said, "confess up." He said, "Have you ever experienced sex?" And the priest said, "Well, Yeah, I'll be honest, he says, I have. And the rabbi says, better than ham, isn't it? I once dined with a Lutheran couple. I'd been preaching in a Lutheran church as a guest speaker. We were having lunch together. They were an elderly couple. They must have thought I was a Lutheran. They were very sad. They had a great sorrow of heart. They began to tell me a thing that was like a great cloud over their lives that brought up a son in the truth. The right way, the right faith. And he departed from it. It was too much for them to bear. Well, I said, what has he done? They said he's become a Presbyterian minister. And he doesn't believe, Mr. Brinsmead, he doesn't believe the supper as we do. Oh, it was too much for them to take. But you know, I was in an embarrassing position because I didn't know whether to laugh in my soup or to cry in my soup because I don't believe the Lutheran view of the supper either. So what could I say to comfort these people? Well, I said, there's some positive sides to think about this. I mean, he could be worse than a Presbyterian. Now, I said, has he turned his back on Christ? Has he left the Christian faith altogether? Oh, no, he hasn't done that. But he doesn't believe the supper. How could he? You see, that's the great raison d'etre of that branch of the Christian church. I'm not singling here Lutherans out for criticism, but whatever is the special thing that makes you separate from everyone else, if you're in that community, if you transgress that, if you call that into question, why? All the sins in the world that you could commit against your fellow man seems to be insignificant compared with that. There was this young Adventist fellow. He'd gone out into the world, he went into drugs, he went into immorality, he just about did everything. And his health was broken, he was trying to find his way back, and he still had some dignity left. He said, well, he said, holding his head high, he said, at least, he said, I never did eat pork. Look at the whole history of the Christian movement. Why, when we think of the intolerance of Christianity, the Christian religion is inherently a very intolerant religion. And if we haven't seen it, we're blind to our own history. Persecution, oppression, repression has not been the exception. It is the norm of the whole of Christianity, Catholic and Protestant. No different. I haven't got time to digress, to give all the instances of all the leading thinkers for nearly 2,000 years. And the victory for religious intolerance is not largely the fruit of Christianity, but often of the Enlightenment, of liberalism, of the deists in this country, and so on. You take that great man, that great Luther. You know, Luther himself said, to sin against faith, he said, to sin against faith, that is big, that is something. That is very serious. To sin against charity is nothing. So anybody who didn't agree with Luther with the supper, he could pull the tablecloth off before Zwingli, write on it the Latin, Opus meum corpus, this is my body, jump up from the table, pull the tablecloth up, hold it up before his Christian brother and says, I won't listen to your logic, I won't listen to your reasoning. If God says I should eat dung, I shall eat dung. And Zwingli wants to hold out his hand and says, well, at least the Christians, let's shake hands. He said he wouldn't even shake hands. The sin against charity to Luther is nothing. For as for the Anabaptists, why Melanchthon draws up a document, if you please, the gentle Melanchthon, that not only the radical Anabaptists, the revolutionary ones, but the peaceful Anabaptists, he signs a thing and writes a document that they ought to be put to death. And Luther himself signs it. Luther rails against Anabaptists. Anybody who doesn't agree with him on the supper or on this, on that, he can rail against people, other Christians, in language which is diabolical, with dreadful curses and insults, which is embarrassing. When he takes up his pen against the King of England, he calls him a big fool. an idiot that even infants ought to mock. And they're only complimentary towards some of the other things. And as for those outside the Christian faith, Jews and Muslims, what Luther says is not safe to print. Even a great soul like Luther, he was so distorted. Western Christianity elevated dogma. Oh, how many people have been executed because they even question a certain aspect. A very, very philosophical doctrine of Trinity was called into question, and a boy in Scotland in the Protestant era, a mere 18-year-old boy, is sentenced to death. Even though they did have an edict of toleration, they paid no attention for it. He'd questioned the doctrine of the Trinity, and the poor kid repents, and he pleads for mercy. It doesn't matter. They hang him. Oh. The sin against dogma. Oh, that's it. Against charity. You see how the thing can become distorted. It's even said of the great Wesley. Wesley was very disturbed about the blasphemous use of God's name, but not disturbed about the blasphemous use of God's creatures in that industrial revolution that was abusing children and oppressing the poor. There's a great distortion here. The same distortion that Jesus, of course, unveils and tries to unmask. We ourselves have been guilty of the same kind of distortions. And we too trivialize sin. Oh yes, there's a lot of preaching against sin, but I want to tell you this. Don't be fooled by a lot of raging and huffing and puffing against sin within the cult. It's mostly a trivialization of sin. And I want to suggest that even the movie industry, if you watch some of those good films, they can give you a better, far more insightful unmasking of human hypocrisy and evil than can the Christian pulpit. Now, isn't that something? The movie industries are better preachers against evil. They understand it far better than those with a cultic mentality. If you maybe seen a movie like the Network, maybe you never see anything like that. You're too unworldly, too spiritual. But Howard Beale there, you may remember, if any of you have seen it, Howard Beale acts the part of the mad prophet of the airwaves. And this fellow, who's quite mad, he rages against evil in this country. He wants to expose it. He's crying out against sin. And then he comes to his great punchline, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And I want everybody, he says, who's listening to my voice, get up right now, he says, and say with me, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. And go out to the window, he said, and cry out to the night air. Come on, he says, get up, get up, get up. Go out, he says. Go out to your window, open the window and cry out to your neighbourhood, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And then you see the condominium, you know, up the big condominium, windows begin to open. And one woman, you know, she sticks her head out of the window and you hear her shrilly voicing out, I'm as mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. And then a big fella puts his head out, you know, and he says, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And voices all over the country. You know, the cheerleaders of the mad prophet of the airways. Of course, the comic irony of it is, and what the film exposes, neither the mad prophet nor those who cheer him on have any real idea what evil is or where it is. Now, I'm going to be scandalous enough to suggest, if you want to hear the mad prophet of the airways, turn on some of these religious programs. You can find them all the time. There they are. Haven't you ever seen them there? It's time to stand up against the evil that is tearing the fabric of our nation. We must take our stand. It's time to stand up against the secular humanists. It's time to stand up against these liberals and to put prayer back into the school and godly men into the nation. And glory, hallelujah, there's the faithful applaud. Right? That's no exposure of evil. That's just trivialization. The movie industry has a better insight to evil than that. And what it really is, look over, one flew over the cuckoo's nest, or They're better preachers. If you want preachers against sin, have a look at that. Have a look at the Australian film, Breaker Morant. Oh, what evil is the hypocrisy of bureaucracy. When good men carry out the letter of the law and prove how righteous they are, that's when the real evil is done. Isn't that amazing? Distortions, the cultic distortions that come about. But Jesus, of course, with his people-centered ethic, this spirit of Jesus, that will even bend the rule or break the rule or suspend the rule, whether it's in the Bible, yes, whether it's in the tradition of the cult, if the needs of people, if compassion demands it, Jesus subordinates everything to the needs of people. That's the ethic of Jesus. And whether you look at his Catholicity of spirit, the way in which he uses the Bible, a freedom from all Bible bashing and biblicism, none of that about Jesus. Bible bashers make people uncomfortable, make outsiders uncomfortable. Jesus never did that. And his ethic, of course, which lampoons the supposed sin, the legal-based view of sin, which only makes people judgmental of others and alienates them from their brother. Why, to live in that cult and to live in the spirit of that cult, that's the essence of evil, because whether it's in the Christian ghetto or the Jewish ghetto, I don't care, it doesn't make any difference. But you put up your religious and often very ridiculous religious distinctions, and by this demonstrate your elitism and superiority over the rest of mankind. This is the thing that makes you unlike God. It's the spirit of the cult that Jesus' spirit opposes. And of course the cult sees what the handwriting on the wall. He's worse than Herod. He's worse than the Romans. He must go. And so armed with the law, they put him to death, and they had good grounds. I want to make this point clear. They had good legal grounds to put Jesus to death because he didn't supposedly, it wasn't just imagined that he broke the law, he really broke it. He really broke what was written in Holy Scripture, and it says there in the law, cursed is everyone who doesn't do everything written to do it, and Jesus didn't always do it. When the demands of people, the needs of people demanded, he would break or bend a written code. But he said the Sabbath man is not made for Sabbath. This must serve the needs of people. He turned the whole thing around. And so armed with the law, the cult says Jesus must die. They said, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die. He's numbered with the transgressors, not as I used to think as a sort of an imaginary imputation of God, where God counts him as one who broke the law and he didn't really break it at all. He's numbered with the transgressors because in the eyes of the law, the inflexible written code, Jesus is no different from a murderer, an adulterer, a thief. So armed with the law, the cult puts Jesus to death. Now, what does the resurrection mean? The resurrection shows us that this is not the end of the Spirit of Christ, but by his death and the dissolution that takes place in his death, through his raising up in his resurrection, his Spirit is released. His living presence in a more powerful way into all the world. It's just the beginning. But what happens to the cult that puts him to death? And the law that puts him to death? The death of Jesus is not the end of Jesus, it's the end of the cult, and it's the end of the law. That's what Ephesians 2 said. By his death he breaks down the wall of petition. He knocks down all those religious things. And even the law with its commandments and ordinances, that old way and that old spirit has to go. And what does Jesus do? As Conzelman said in his excellent little book on Jesus, the message of Jesus is something which detaches the individual from the cult, where he finds his security and opens him up to his neighbour by making love possible. Isn't that beautiful? That's what Jesus does, is detaches you from the cult, from the security, from the spirit of that cult. It gets you out from that little, you know, wall of petition, living there behind there, practicing your cultic religious distinction. It brings you out from that. It opens you up to the whole human race. It opens you up to your neighbour and thereby makes love possible. In other words, as long as you're in the cult and imprisoned by the spirit of the cult, love is not possible because you've been alienated by the cult from your fellow man. You are forced to be judgmental. You are forced to be separated from him, right? You have not truly joined the human race, and so on. Now here is the vital question that we have to wrestle with. Did Jesus overthrow that cult at such a price to himself in order that his followers set up another one and found the Christian religion? I want to suggest it was not Jesus who founded the Christian religion, nor the Christian church as we know it. It has been a great detour of history and to a very large extent a distortion and a misinterpretation of the true intent and spirit of Jesus. And I'm not alone in saying this. If I had the time, I could take some of the best Roman Catholic authors and scholars today, and some of the best Protestant scholars today, who as today we are facing the dissolution of Western Christianity, and there's a growing consensus it wasn't the intent of Jesus to found a religious organisation with a legal membership. It was not in the intent of Jesus to found such a religious cult. It was a misunderstanding of the spirit and intent of Jesus, or as Conzelman says in his book, Jesus did not overthrow the Jewish sect in order to establish a Christian one. But you say, there's some justification in the New Testament. Doesn't the New Testament give some support for this development of the organisation and the institutionalisation of the Christian church? I'll be frank enough to admit you can find evidence and support for that in the New Testament. Although the total evidence, it looks now, because there's such diversity in New Testament, if you look at Stephen and some of the things Paul said and did when he refused to carry legal credentials from the Jerusalem church because his idea of authority was charismatic and not organisational, right? And various other things. And if you look at the message of Hebrews that holds up before the Christian the model of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in tents, and he gives the appeal, let's get out of leave the camp and go out to where Jesus is. There's evidence in the New Testament that points in another direction. If we take this view of every witness in the New Testament, every witness says pat exactly the same thing. Of course we miss the whole thing. There is evidence of going down the road of institutionalisation and more rigid control, because as the Christian movement grows, there is evidence that that some of the leaders of the church lose their nerve, or they can't wholly get rid of this cultic spirit even of Judaism. They want to impose their cultic spirit on Gentile Christians, and as disorder or false teachers confront the Christian church, they try to bring in more law and order and lose faith in the spirit, and certainly retreat from the radical freedom of Jesus. A little bit here like the children of Israel camped at Mount Sinai, you remember, and when Moses was up in the mount and did not come back again when they thought he should, they take their model from Egypt, right, and begin to get to Canaan and make up schemes to get to Canaan by other means. Did the Christian church did that? There's evidence, yes, they did. But if what I say is true, we've gone on a long detour in the Christian religion. And it's not good enough just to go back to the reformers. We'll have to go right back again. But if you're going to say now, this is why I took the preliminary session, if you're going to come back and say these earthen vessels, they're all absolutely, all the earthen vessels, there's no cracks in there, they're all absolutely inerrant and infallible, which they themselves, of course, don't claim to be. We don't even know who wrote most of the documents. The church wrote them, of course, individuals in the church, and the church put them in there. But if we're going to take that rigid position that the documents themselves, well, there's nothing more to say. All I can say, Jesus comes promising the electrifying message and the freedom of the kingdom of God, and lo, what takes place? We have this dull Christian church arrives as the fulfillment of his promise. And we're shut up to the fact that all the best we can expect for now is reformers coming along like Luther to overthrow one form of oppression and replace it by another. Why, he spoke about the clergy and the monks of his day, the religious professionals, and Luther says they're like fleas on the Almighty's fur coat. But if that be true, then he brought in some other kind of fleas, Protestant ones. And that's what we've had. People engage in an exodus from one form of fundamentalism and they go back into another. There's no difference. And today's liberators become tomorrow's oppressors. Is that all the best? Is that the best we can hope for? Is that the true expression of the Spirit of Jesus? I don't believe it is. The Spirit of Jesus is against the Jewish cult. It is against the Christian cult. It bursts through all of that. There's a Catholicity, a scandalous Catholicity about it. Doesn't the world need that today? Torn apart, facing nuclear holocaust? The world doesn't need religion. It's not going to help the world to bring them into the Christian cult. Oh yeah, we Christians, we can work our tails off trying to make Christians of everybody. I think the evidence ought to point to the fact God doesn't. Someone says to me, but you must belong. The cult comes along and says, but you have to belong somewhere. The problem with the cult is that they won't let you belong. That is, they won't let you belong to the human race. They insist you have to go into some silly sectarian prison, erect your mid-wall of petition that separates you effectively from the human race, and hive off into some special elitist group somewhere that keeps you separated from the human race. Of course we ought to belong where Jesus belonged. He belonged to the human race. God so loved the world, he gave him to the human race, and those who have the Spirit of Christ will embrace the human race without distinctions and religious barriers. What the world needs today is to be infected with that Spirit of Jesus that will free us from all that elitism and arrogance and sectarianism and biblicism and law-based morality, and free us for others and bring us out there behind that false security and open us up to our neighbour and make love possible. I had one pious fellow ask me the other day, he says, but where do you fellowship? No, he didn't say that. He put the emphasis on. He says, where do you have regular fellowship? Well, I have to admit at the moment I don't have regular fellowship with Christians. And I'll be frank enough to admit that I'm more comfortable with non-religious people than I am in the religious ghetto. It's very stuffy in there. But he said to me, where do you have regular fellowship? Well, I said, the only regular fellowship I really have here, I said, with just a group of workmen. I said, we just happen to meet once a week. No one professes there any particular religion. It's not religious at all. We're just a group of pagans. But I said, we talk about everything, Jesus, politics, economics, no barriers. We accept each other. Marvellous. That's great fellowship. I'm more at home there. But he said, how do you practice the Lord's Supper? Well, I said, I have a bit of Luther's libation. That's what we have. I said, I prefer Heineken. So I said, we have Heineken and potato chips. Doesn't sound too good, does it? Looks like I've gone to the devil. But I tell you what, that's a marvellous feeling, really, to join the human race. Why, when I was there practicing my particular religious piety, they couldn't even get near me. But somehow things are a lot different these days. The biggest problem I have, I get invited to so many parties that my waistline is not looking too good. But I think the day of the old Christian ghetto is over. And I have no desire to get people into it. I wouldn't wish it upon them. And what the world needs today is to be infected with a new spirit. Look how the world is torn apart religiously. Look at this spirit in Ireland, in Lebanon. It's religion, it's fanaticism, it's fundamentalism. Or India, you can go to the greatest trouble spots of the world. It's not just racial, it's religious. And this fanatical, God is right, God is on our side, we have the infallible, and so on and so on. And for the sake of the truth, bodies are being ground up everywhere. Astonishing things being done in God's name in the world. What do we need? New approach. A spirit of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of acceptance, of belonging that will ignore all distinctions, racial, religious, sexual, treat men, people, as people. Let's have faith in the Spirit of Christ, not just the attitude of Christ. The resurrection is the living presence. The resurrected, let's believe He is alive, that we can be infected by His Spirit. Let's be optimistic and go out into the world like those first Hellenists went out into the world and infect our fellow men with a new spirit. They can be responsive. Often people are responsive to the Spirit of Christ who've never heard the information on the historical Christ. And in the real sense, wherever men respond to that Spirit, they are before God real believers in Christ and will rise in the judgment and condemn many Christians who had certain theological information and were foreigners to that Spirit. Right? That is the freedom we need, and that will open up a new day. Thank you. Thank you.